The moments glided on, while a feeling of good fellowship passed around the circle like a mystic cord, holding and binding these people together with jest and laughter. Monsieur Ratignolle was the first to break the pleasant charm. At 10 o'clock he excused himself. Madame Ratignolle was waiting for him at home. She was bien souffrante, and she was filled with vague dread, which only her husband's presence could allay. Mademoiselle Reisz arose with Monsieur Ratignolle, who offered to escort her to the car. She had eaten well, she had tasted the good, rich wines, and they must have turned her head, for she bowed pleasantly to all as she withdrew from table. She kissed Edna upon the shoulder and whispered, "Bonne nuit, ma reine, soyez sagée." She had been a little bewildered upon rising or rather descending from her cushions, and Monsieur Ratignolle gallantly took her arm and led her away. Mrs. Highcamp was waving a garland of roses, yellow and red. When she had finished the garland, she laid it lightly upon Victor's black curls. He was reclining far back in the luxurious chair, holding a glass of champagne to the light, as if a magician wand had touched him. The garland of roses transformed into a vision of oriental beauty. His cheeks were the color of crushed grapes, and his dusky eyes glowed with languishing fire. "Sapristi!" exclaimed Arobin. But Mrs. Highcamp had no one more touch to add to the picture. She took from the back of her chair a white silken scarf with which she had covered her shoulders in the early part of the evening. She dropped it across the boy in graceful folds, and in a way to conceal his black conventional evening dress. She did not seem to mind what she did to him, only smiled, showing a faint gleam of white teeth, while he continued to gaze him narrowing eyes at the light through his glass of champagne. "Oh, to be able to paint in colour rather than in words!" exclaimed Miss Mayblunt, losing herself in the rhapsodic dream as she looked at him. There was a graven image of desire, painted with red blood on a ground of gold, murmured Cornbury under his breath. The effect of the wine upon Victor was to charge his accustomed volubility into silence. He seemed to have abandoned himself to a reverie and to be seeing pleasing visions in the amber bed. "Sing," entreated Mrs. Highcamp. "Won't you sing to us?" "Let him alone," said Arobin. "He's posing," offered Mr. Merriman. "Let him have it out." "I believe he's paralyzed," laughed Mrs. Merriman, and leaning over the youth's chair, she shook the glass from his hand and held it to his lips. He sipped the wine slowly, and when he had drained the glass she laid it upon the table and wiped his lips with her little filmy handkerchief. "Yes, I'll sing for you," he said, turning his chair toward Mrs. Highcamp. He clasped his hands behind his head, and looking up at the ceiling began to hum a little, trying his voice like a musician tuning an instrument. Then, looking at Edna, he began to sing. "Ah, si tu savais." "Stop!" she cried. "Don't sing that. I don't want you to sing it." And she laid her glass so impetuously and blindly upon the table as to shatter it against a carafee. The wine spilled over Arobin's leg, and some of it trickled down upon Mrs. Highcamp's back. Was gone. Victor had lost all ideas of courtesy, or else he thought his hostess was not in earnest, for he laughed and went on. "Ah, si tu savais ce que tes yeux me disaient." "Oh, you mustn't!" exclaimed Edna, and pushing back her chair, she got up, and going behind him, placed her hand over his mouth. He kissed the soap soft palm that pressed upon his lips. "No, no, I won't, Mrs. Pontellier. I didn't know you meant it," looking up at her with caressing eyes. The touch of his lips was like a pleasing string to her hand. She lifted the garland of roses from his head and flung it across the room. "Come, Victor, you've paused long enough. Give Mrs. Highcamp her scarf." Mrs. Highcamp unwrapped the scarf from about him with her own hands. Miss Maybloom and Mr. Gouvernail suddenly conceived the notion that it was time to say good night, and Mr. and Mrs. Merriman wondered how it could be so late. Before parting from Victor, Mrs. Highcamp invited him to call upon her daughter, who she knew would be charmed to meet him and talk French and sing French songs with him. Victor expressed his desire and intention to call upon Miss Highcamp at the first opportunity which presented itself. He asked if Arobin were going his way. Arobin was not. The mandolin players had long since stolen away. A profound stillness had fallen upon the broad, beautiful street. The voices of Edna's disbanding guests jarred like a discordant note upon the quiet harmony of the night.